This episode is sponsored by KENDO UI. KENDO UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KENDO UI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Chris Ferdinandi.
Hey everyone, coming in from Boston.
Cory House.
Hello from Kansas City.
I'm tempted to ask you to remind people who you are. Aimee Knight.
Hey from Nashville.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Nicholas Zakas.
Hey everybody.
All right, well, and Cory, I'm excited to have you back. I am giving you a bad time though.
Glad to be back, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, Nicholas, do you want to remind people who you are? We haven't had you on for a little while.
Yeah, I think it's actually been about 5 years since I was on last. And I can't actually remember what we talked about that time. But a couple years later, you invited me on, and I unfortunately wasn't able to come to talk about ESLint. But we were able to schedule a bunch of the maintainers to join you instead. And that's probably what people know me for most at this point is I created ESLint, kind of kicked that off, and now it's being maintained by a great group of people.
Well, that's good to hear. We brought you on to talk about the origin of ESLint. But before we do that, maybe we should get an introduction or a little bit of an explanation of what it is for people who aren't using something like it.
Yeah, so ESLint is a linter for JavaScript. So it falls in the same category as JSLint, which was created by Doug Crockford, and a later fork called JSHint, which was started by Anton Kovalyov. Hope I'm saying that right, Anton. And the purpose of ESLint, just like JSLint and JSHint, was really to help you find problems with your code. It has grown quite a bit since I first started it. And now it can help you not only with finding errors and potential bugs, but also work with enforcing style guides and even auto-formatting your code.
Yeah, it's handy to get that feedback and to keep things consistent. So where did it come from?
Well, the idea first popped into my head when I was working at Box. And I had just joined, I think I was maybe there a month or two and still getting used to the systems and the tools and the processes that we had when one of my teammates was working on a bug that had come in. At the time, we were still supporting IE 7, and the report was basically that nothing was working at all. And after investigating, my teammate found that somebody had written some JavaScript code that was using the native XML HTTP request object to make an AJAX request. And that wasn't the best practice of the company at the time. We had a utility that we were supposed to be using instead, but for whatever reason, the person who wrote that code was unaware of that. And so when using this native XML HTTP request object in IE 7 specifically, there was a little bit of trickiness to it in that it really was just a wrapper around the ActiveX implementation that we were all using in IE 6. And the company who reported the bug had a policy on their network that ActiveX was disabled for everybody using IE. And that would then disable XML HTTP request and nothing would work. So the solution was to use the library that we had that had a workaround for those situations. And also to add a line in what at the time we called a linter, but was really just a regular expression matcher that would run on the build for all JavaScript files. And it was basically just a text file that had each line was one regular expression. And if you tried to run your code through the build process, that check would run, and it would run the regular expression against your JavaScript code, and it would fail if any of the regular expressions matched. So a line for XML HTTP request was added into that text file. And when I was looking at that, I thought, I'm really not comfortable using regular expressions to evaluate code like this, because you have no sense of the context that the code exists in. You could be matching inside of a string. You could be matching a comment. It's really not a good way to be checking your code for problems. And that kind of started me on this journey of trying to figure out a better way to lint code.
So, Nicholas, with that in mind, why did you choose to create a product versus using some other options that were available, or were JSLint and JSHint not on the market at this time?
So both JSLint and JSHint were around. And I think by that time, JSHint was pretty much the de facto tool that everybody was using. And my first thought was, I wonder if JSHint can help with this problem. Because when I had worked at Yahoo, my team had actually created a custom version of JSLint to flag problems that we wanted to be aware of that maybe were not generally applicable to people outside of our team. And I went back to look at JSHint for that purpose too, and saw on their roadmap was actually a plan to implement a plugin system where you could create your own rules. And immediately thought, that's great. That's exactly what we need. And why try to build something new if a tool I'm already using is going to be able to do the same thing?
Right.
So I didn't see anything on GitHub about the status of that. So I emailed Anton directly and asked him, what the plan was. And he said, unfortunately, it looked like they weren't going to be getting to that. And at that point in time, I actually kind of apologized to him and said, well, I hope you won't take offense if I try to make something for that purpose, because I really need it. And I think it would be useful to other people too. And it's not that I don't appreciate JSHint. It just seems like what I need isn't on the roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So I didn't, my history with these only dates back to around the time they were customizable. So it actually didn't occur to me that there was a time where that maybe wasn't the case.
I know, it's really interesting to me to hear you say how they were basing it off of regular expressions, because as I understand it now, it builds up this abstract syntax tree, and that's how you can kind of create your own rules. So it's interesting to me to hear how that has evolved.
Yeah, it was the interesting thing about the tool set at Box was that there was a PHP linter as part of the build as well. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think one of the engineers at Box actually wrote it. And it would parse the PHP into an abstract syntax tree and then poke at the AST to find problems with it. And that struck me as something that was much more rational.
Yes, I don't.
Than using regular expressions.
Yes, I don't want to be writing regular expressions for that. Well, I was going to ask, in your opinion, why do you think that ESLint, I would say, is kind of the standard now?
Well, I think a large amount of it has to do with how easy it is to plug things in. And from the first days of ESLint, that was always my goal, was just I wanted to make sure that the tool itself didn't get boxed in any way. Because in going back over the history, we had JSLint, which basically Doug Crockford reigned over, and any change that you wanted to get into there, he was the sole arbiter of whether or not it would land. And that was ultimately what led to the fork in JSHint, which was much more community driven. But even so, when there's a small team maintaining a tool that a lot of people are using, it's virtually impossible to keep up with all of the requests. And you end up with, instead of the benevolent dictator for life, you end up with a benevolent team of people for life. And people start to complain, say, well, they're not listening. And really, it's not that they're not listening. There just isn't enough developer bandwidth, especially for people who are maintaining it in their spare time, to be able to respond and potentially implement all of the suggestions. And I saw that early on, not only from just following JSHint, and I think I probably contributed 2 or 3 pull requests to that, but there was another project that I worked on with Nicole Sullivan called ESLint, which I think was the first linter for CSS. And
Which I
we
love,
ran into
by
that
the way.
problem there, where oh, thank you. Where just the amount of feedback and the amount of suggestions and CSS language continuing to develop, it was just really hard to keep up with all of that, just coming into just the 2 of us. And so with ESLint, I really wanted to flip the script and make it so that there was no gatekeeper to the functionality you wanted to ESLint. If you wanted something, then you should be able to write a plugin and then at runtime just tell ESLint to use that plugin. So you wouldn't have to wait for me or somebody else on the team to give you permission to do what you wanted to do with ESLint. And because it was so pluggable, that meant that when things like React came along, we didn't have to do anything to support React except make sure that you could specify a different parser for your code. And that was one of the first requests that we got to add configuration beyond writing your own rules. Somebody at Facebook, and my memory is failing me here, I apologize for that, just asked, we have this custom parser to be able to parse JSX syntax. And if you would just expose a way to let us plug in that parser, then we could use ESLint on React code. And that was pretty easy to do because we were using Esprima at the time, the JavaScript parser that Aria Hidea had created. So it wasn't even something that was built into ESLint. And so we were able to expose the parser property in the configuration. Facebook could use their custom parser, and off they went. And because that was the only linter that was capable of parsing the JSX code, it became a tool that just became part of the React toolkit and part of what Facebook started recommending to other people using React. And I don't think I need to go over what happened with React becoming the most popular JavaScript development framework out there.
So, Nicholas, one thing that I found really interesting about ESLint is how it can also be an educational tool for a development team. And by that, I mean, especially when ES6 came out, the ability to add in some linting rules that would tell people, hey, as a team, we've decided not to use var, we're going to use let or const instead. And that's just one example among many. I mean, drawing attention to people and opportunities for these features. When you created ESLint, did you see that also as an opportunity to use it as an education tool for features that people might not have yet been aware of in the language?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know one of the problems that I've had in my career was how do you start to introduce newer practices, newer syntax, newer ways of doing things into an organization that is probably running at capacity. That there's not a lot of teams that I've been on where the company has said, okay, all of you can go off and for a week, go upgrade your skills, take some courses, or we'll bring instructors on site. That just hasn't happened a lot in my career. And as a result of that, I would usually find when I joined a new team that there were some, sometimes small, sometimes large problems in the code base that were just really hard to get resolved, because when one person recognizes this, there's not always a great way within a team or within a company to be able to share that information, and certainly not in a non-confrontational way. Right? I mean, if you're a tech lead and you want to rule with an iron fist and you go around saying we shouldn't be doing that anymore, well, that's one way to do it. But your tenure in that job is probably not going to be very long, because people will feel like you're picking on you. And I've always believed that it's better to get angry at a tool than it is to get angry at a person. I think Doug Crockford introduced us to that idea when he warned us that JSLint could hurt your feelings. And that is actually better than your teammate hurting your feelings. You can have a common enemy in the tool, but you don't want to have enemies within your team. And so I really did see it as like, okay, as ES6 was coming along, how can we start to nudge people? And not from the start, my personal view of ESLint was that it should not have its own opinion, but it should be able to make recommendations. And a lot of the early rules were just simply that, the recommendations of like, hey, did you know that there actually is a less error-prone way to do what you're doing? And when ES6 came along, hey, did you know that you're actually not changing the value of this variable? So you could change it to a const if you wanted to. And I think that the full power of ESLint as a learning tool really became apparent, not only as EX6 started being implemented, but also I think as the React plugin for ESLint started becoming more popular, where we had people in the React community being able to codify best practices for React and also use that as a way to introduce people to new React features as they became available. So it was definitely part of my vision for ESLint early on. And I think that it's one of those things about the ESLint community that I enjoy the most, is both by people submitting rules to the project itself and also creating plugins like the React plugin. How ESLint has been able to teach people about not just JavaScript syntax itself, but also about other languages and frameworks and stuff like that.
Great answer. Okay, so I wasn't the only one that thought of that. So, and I'm not surprised to hear it either. So do you feel, though, that there is a best practice for getting a team started on ESLint? I mean, what is your recommendation for a team that's not doing linting today? Do you get the whole team in a room and talk through the litany of options, or do you have somebody go in and take their best guess and turn a few things on and see who screams? What have you seen work, or some things that people should maybe avoid?
So the thing that I always recommend for a team that isn't doing any JavaScript linting at all is, first and foremost, get ESLint into your system with 0 rules turned on, because you will at least then be getting syntax checking, and it introduces that mindset into your development process that there is something we can do to automatically check JavaScript before it goes through our build pipeline and out into production. So just getting syntax checking as part of your build, you'll actually see a pretty significant improvement in the number of bugs that are making it out to production. After that, I recommend using the default, what we call the ESLint recommended configuration. And that has all of the things that we've found are most likely errors. And by errors, I mean runtime errors, as opposed to syntax errors. And you can go through as a team with those. And sometimes it's easier just to enable that check on new commits, so you don't go through an entire code base with that check. But using those ESLint recommended rules will immediately clean up a lot of problems that you might not have even recognized in your code. And if you find any of the rules are either there are too many problems found with those rules, I usually recommend that instead of turning them off, you just set the severity to warning instead of error. And that was something that I designed from the start because we ran into this problem at Box when we tried to introduce JSHint, that at first we turned on as many rules as we could. And it was driving people crazy because we were blocking the build and they didn't feel like, when I'm committing this file that I didn't even write, I'm just making a change to it. Why should I be responsible for fixing everything in it before I can get my change in? And so the idea with the different severity levels in ESLint was, you don't want to turn off rules so that people aren't aware that there's a problem. So the warning level will let you have the rule on so people are aware of the problem, but it won't block the build. It doesn't cause the exit code to be non-zero. And doing that alone will give you a lot of benefit for ESLint. And I think the next step, and what you're probably hinting at, is how do you decide as a team on the rules that are maybe not for finding errors, but are more stylistic in nature. So do we use semicolons? Do we not use semicolons? Do we use tabs? Do we use four spaces? Stuff like that. So to figure that out, I am a very big proponent of finding an existing style guide and just adopting it wholesale. ESLint at this point has, I think, over 200 rules, and probably more than half or close to half are stylistic in nature. And if you want a good way to lose an entire day of developer time, you put a bunch of developers in a room and ask them to go through that list and figure out what everybody will agree to. It's really not worth it. So find something that you can get most people to agree with off the bat, and just agree to stick with it even if it's not your favorite format, because at the end of the day, and I've actually had to mediate several of these conversations, there is no right or wrong when it comes to stylistic preferences. It really is just getting everybody to do the same thing. And I think it was Crockford who said in one of his talks about JSLint that, whether you drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road doesn't really matter so long as everybody else is doing the same thing. And I believe that about style guides too. Like it's, for some reason, it tends to get very emotional and heated. I think I understand a little bit about why that is. But I think the best thing for the team as a whole is, look, you just find a guide that you're willing to live with. ESLint itself, if you run it with the --init command, will give you a list of popular style guides. And just pick one and get everybody to agree that, hey, no matter what your personal preference is, we've all just decided this is the thing we're going to do because as a team, that's the one thing that we can all agree on. And of course, as you go forward, you can tweak the rules if you find things are really not working very well for your team. But if you can at least start with a baseline that's already defined, I think you'll end up with a happier team going forward.
I love the CLI tool. I was just setting up a project this weekend and use that. And the fact that I can either go through the option where I pick one of the style guides that are already out there and pretty popular, or it, ask me a bunch of questions about what I like, and then it's automatically going to create my config for me. That was super helpful. But my question for you, I'm kind of just curious as the person who created this, if you had to pick like 2 or 3 rules that you are super helpful. Like I know for me, if I'm working on a new project, I would always want to add rules for cyclomatic complexity and max parameters, just because I feel like those kind of lead you into the pit of success. So I'm kind of curious if you have any favorites. And I'd be curious.
Please pick tabs versus spaces.
I'd be curious the panels as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to touch briefly on indentation, whether you like 4 spaces or whether you are completely wild and like tabs, I do think that the indent rule is very helpful just for wiping out, like eliminating that discussion from your team whatsoever. Like, you know what? Have your editor set up however you want. But on my pre-commit hook, we're going to run ESLint and everything's going to end up the way that it's supposed to be before it gets into source control. Like you can eliminate a lot of tension on a team with that. But in terms of my favorite rules, I tend to lean towards the ones that have saved me the most. So the no unused vars has been very helpful to me. Like I do have this tendency to create a lot of variables and then refactor and then forget about variables that I created earlier on. So no unused vars is has been really helpful just to me personally.
I should have thrown
another
that
one. I'm probably going to another one, and I'm probably going to mess up the name because there are a few hundred rules and I can't remember them all specifically. Is I think it's called no unexpected new line. And the goal of the rule is to tell you when the JavaScript engine is going to insert a semicolon for you. So automatic semicolon insertion is still something that, even me, I think I've been writing JavaScript for close to 20 years. I still can mess that up. And that rule, and it's probably not exactly that, but no unexpected new line or no unexpected multi-line. That sounds like that might be more correct. And that was something that we added in order to help with standard JS because there was really no check. We had the semi rule, which would let you know if you needed a semicolon or not, but we didn't really have anything that could warn when JavaScript was going to automatically be inserting a semicolon for you. So that actually helped me out, even though I use semicolons. That's helped me find some errors as well. So that's one of my favorite ones. And I think rounding out my top 3 is probably prefer const, because before that, I really didn't realize how frequently I was setting variables just once and then never changing their value again. That was surprising to me. And using ESLint was what made me realize that I could use const way more than I was. So those are my top 3 most useful. But I also have one that makes me giggle a lot, and I really appreciate that. And that's the Yoda rule, or I think it might be no Yoda, where that prevents you from putting the constant value first using an equality operator. So there was a point in time where people were saying, well, in order to make sure that you don't use the single equal sign instead of the double equal sign, where you would end up doing an assignment instead of a comparison, you should always put the constant value first. So instead of saying color is not equal to red, you would say red is not equal to color, and that sounds kind of like how Yoda talks in the Star Wars series. And so that Yoda rule is something that still just makes me smile to this day.
Red it is not.
Very popular in the WordPress community. The Yoda comparisons.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io. PHP, this is not.
Oh God, please no. sorry.
They drive me nuts.
I'm not a language hater. It's not my favorite. If that's your favorite, then I think that's great.
So Nicholas, what is your take on running fix? Because I've had mixed feelings about that as potentially a default. And I say that because, again, if we're talking about ESLint as at least partially an education tool, fix can eliminate an opportunity for educating people in some minor ways, although it is certainly handy in all sorts of ways where the minutia of, oh, I forgot a semicolon. Well, just fix it for me. Thank you very much, ESLint. That's nice. But do you feel that it makes sense to run fix more or less automatically as part of your application's ESLint config?
I think that it depends. The original idea behind fix was really more of doing a one-time at the start, just fix everything that ESLint can find wrong in my code base because I really don't want to go through it by hand. And it kind of morphed into more of a tool that people are using all the time. And I too have mixed feelings about that. I always felt like the greatest value that you get from running fix is always when you first install ESLint in your project or when you first enable a new rule. Yeah, I think in those situations, you get so much value out of running fix that you should make sure that that happens all the time. I think that when people started getting really aggressive with their code styles, that kind of started us down this path of people using fix just by default. I know a lot of people enable it in their editors now. And to be honest, at the beginning, I only ever thought that ESLint would be used either in a pre-commit hook or as part of a build system. And so as part of a pre-commit hook, it could be helpful to automatically fix things. And then as part of a build system, you obviously wouldn't want to automatically fix things because there's no way to get that artifact. And in case anybody listening is wondering, why doesn't ESLint just automatically fix all the time? Well, it's for that reason, is there are some parts of your system where you can't do anything with the fixed artifact, and what you really need is just a notification that there was something wrong, like deep in your CI system. But I still don't have fix enabled in my editor. I would much rather see the problems that it's finding and then decide if I want to fix or not. But I think this really can come down to a team decision on, do you want to run fix at the point that the developer is writing the code? Do you want to run fix pre-commit? Do you want to run it as part of a build, as you're bundling up your assets locally first? It really seems like more of a personal preference, and I'm still a bit on the fence about it. even though I'm leaning more towards not doing fix while I'm coding, doing it pre-commit as my default way of developing.
So do you happen to run Prettier as well?
I do not.
You do not? Okay. Because I thought it was interesting too, how Prettier has crept in on some of this space.
Yeah, and I don't have anything against Prettier. I'm just a big believer in dog fooding what you're working on. And I think that Prettier occupies a very interesting space where, ESLint's mantra has always been, configure whatever you want. If there isn't something in there, add it yourself. And Prettier is kind of at the opposite end of that, of like, hey, look, we'll give you a few options, but that's pretty much all we're going to give you. And you either like that and you can live with it. And there's definitely a school of thought that appreciates that. And I, in fact, appreciate that approach. Because now that we're in, I don't know what, year 5, 6, 7 of ESLint development, needing to provide an option for everybody's preference for every little style has really kind of been eye-opening. Because at the beginning, I thought there's probably about 5 styles that everybody cares about. But in reality, there are hundreds that people care about. And part of the advice I gave to Prettier early on when they were trying to figure out, should we respect ESLint configurations or not, was not to, because they would end up in a maintenance hole that they would never get out of, just trying to constantly keep up with all the new flags and options that ESLint was adding. And so I am completely on board with people who think that they want to use Prettier for formatting their code, and they want to use ESLint just to check for potential errors or best practices related to frameworks and libraries, or even just best practices on their teams and custom rules that their teams create. I think that can make a lot of sense. And that's also part of why we provide the ESLint recommended rule configuration, so that if you do decide to use Prettier or something else to format your code, there still is an easy ESLint configuration to start with where you can get a lot of value as well.
Good stuff. Thanks.
So what's next for ESLint and what's next for you?
Well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what's next for ESLint. I haven't been involved in actively maintaining ESLint for the past couple of years. I do pop in occasionally to help out if there are questions that people want feedback on, or if they're just having a hard time making a decision. But in general, the direction of ESLint has been, let's keep adding rules that help people adopt new language features. Let's keep adding rules that help people avoid language hazards. And let's keep making sure that ESLint is pluggable enough that wherever the JavaScript community goes, ESLint is there to support them. Doesn't mean that there won't be other changes coming in the future, but at least for the time being, there's really, I think, a kind of virtuous cycle between the yearly ECMAScript releases, tools like Babel introducing parsers for new syntax, and then tools like ESLint introducing rules to help people adopt and use those new features better. For myself and what's going on in the future, I haven't been involved in ESLint because I've been focusing on my health. A few years ago, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and that was serious enough that I had to stop working. And that also meant stopping contributing to ESLint and other open source projects. And that's also why I wasn't able to join you guys a couple of years ago when you wanted to talk about ESLint. Fortunately, just by my presence here, hopefully it's obvious that I'm doing a bit better. And I could potentially still be a couple of years away from getting back to rejoining the workforce full time and getting back to writing books and blog posts and stuff like that. But the trajectory is definitely upward. And just wanted to use this opportunity to stress the importance to everybody listening of really just taking care of yourself. There's a lot of interesting stuff that we do as software developers, and it's fun to get wrapped up in new technologies and new ways of doing things and fight about our favorite coding styles and work on night and weekend projects. But ultimately, if you don't have your health, none of that is really going to matter. And there's a few things I'd really like to just encourage everybody to do to take care of themselves better, because software does tend to be a very high stress industry, even if we don't realize it. And that can take a toll on your body because a lot of people are unaware, but when your body is under stress, your immune system actually just shuts down. And that's part of the fight or flight response to help you get away from danger. And that's supposed to be a temporary state. But for a lot of us, we're working too much. I myself was doing this. I'd work my regular job and then I would come home and write books and be working on open source stuff and just really never had an off switch. And that's probably why I got as sick as I did. My immunity was just too suppressed from all of that. So I'd like to encourage everybody to just really think about the amount of time that you are spending being driven and trying to achieve things, and try to balance that out more with relaxing and spending time with your friends and family. Take the vacation time that you have, because whether you think you need it or you don't, you actually do. If you're feeling sick, please stay home and take care of yourself. Try to avoid working from home when you're sick. Just take the time, relax, do what you have to do to feel better. Try to get a hobby outside of tech to really just let your tech mind rest a little bit. I know some devs who are just tremendously artistic, great musicians, great artists, and they've actually shown in studies that when you take time to sort of turn off your analytic brain and focus more on your artistic side, it actually helps your analytic brain a lot, both by decompressing and just creating more pathways in your brain so that when you come back to the more technical stuff, you actually have new ways of thinking that help you be better at your job. And please save your money, because one of the things that I learned through this whole ordeal is that you might think that the disability insurance your company has for you will be there, but it might not. There's a lot that you have to go through in order to prove that you are, quote unquote, disabled enough to collect that. It actually took me over 2 years in order to begin collecting. So I just am hoping that everybody can learn from what I've been through and hopefully take better care of themselves so that you can avoid the situation I ended up in, where Lyme disease is spread by tick bites. So there was really not much I could do to avoid that. But if I had taken better care of myself while I was working, chances are I wouldn't have gotten as run down as I got.
That is so good. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I know that we've had conversations, over the last little while, just about how you're doing and what's going on and things like that. And, just it's encouraging to me that, even after, everything that you've kind of suffered through with this disease, that you're still trying to come back. You're still, taking the steps to take care of yourself and move forward. And I think a lot of times we take things for granted and we just assume that everything's going to keep going the way that we want it to. And yeah, so I really love the idea of A, taking care of yourself, and then B, being ready in case something just goes sideways, because you can't always count on everything being the way that you think it always will be. And so I really appreciate the advice there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really was, a lot of people are unaware of this, but what happened to me was, I left work one Friday afternoon and, had a pretty normal weekend, and my health had been on the decline, but I really was better at taking care of myself at that point. And I rested all weekend, but then Monday I woke up and I just couldn't get out of bed. And that basically started this whole period where I basically just stopped leaving the house completely. And that's how quickly things can change for you. So definitely, I really harp on people a lot now to save their money, because if I didn't have savings and I had to go 2 years without any income whatsoever, there would be a very different tenor to my story. So I definitely want to encourage everybody to just, if you can hold off on getting that latest iPhone for a few months and stick that money in a savings account, you might find that to be very helpful in the future.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we probably ought to head over to picks. But before we do that, where do people find you online, Nicholas?
Yep. So I just changed my domain name. You can now find my blog at humanwhocodes.com. It's a little bit easier for people to get than my old domain name. You can find me on Twitter. My username is slicknet, SLICKNET.
And I know that you're talking about your recovery, but is there anything that people can do to help you in the meantime? Before you answer, though, I just want to plug one of the things that you can probably do is go buy Nicholas's books, and you won't regret it. They're terrific books. I'm going to put a link in here to Amazon and his author profile so you can find his books. But is there anything else that we can do to, help you out while you're getting through this and kind of coming back to, full whatever it is that you want to wind up at?
Yeah, absolutely. Buying books is always helpful for a number of reasons. I would say that if you can spend some time contributing to ESLint, that's also a very big help. There's a great team of people who are maintaining that project right now. And they're doing it in their free time, and they are constantly just under a deluge of issues and pull requests and everything that comes with maintaining a popular open source project. And they don't get a lot of attention. They're all just, when I say great people, I don't just mean, they're really good developers. I mean, they are great people. They are incredibly welcoming. They're very supportive of each other, of me, of the community in general. They love helping out new contributors. And they're all just trying to squeeze in helping the project in between their full-time jobs. So anything you can do to help them would really help me, because I want to make sure that those folks are as healthy and happy and productive as they possibly can be. And if for me personally, honestly, I love when people tweet at me and just say hi. I love hearing about how my books or my talks or whatever helped them. I love hearing other people's stories about challenges that they've overcome. I've really been grateful to hear from other people who've been dealing with chronic illnesses themselves, and how they've been dealing and how they've held strong. And if you are feeling charitable in a monetary sense, I do want to stress that I don't want you to send me money. I'm doing fine financially. But if you want to donate to something, there's a wonderful foundation called the Light Foundation. And they give money to children with Lyme disease who cannot afford treatment. It's a wonderful organization based close to where I am out here in California. There's a lot of really wonderful people and supportive people who are running that organization, people who have been touched by Lyme disease themselves and have come out the other side. And it's really just a tremendous organization, and one that I would encourage everybody to support if you're so inclined.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. And yeah, just some people aren't comfortable talking about their situation, especially when it's not ideal. And so I appreciate you just coming on and making us think about this a little bit.
Absolutely.
Let's go ahead and do some picks. Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Aimee, do you have some picks for us?
So my first pick is something that I saw. I'm in a developer advocacy channel or like a Facebook group, and somebody posted this that came out from Stripe called the Developer Coefficient. And basically, it talks about, I would encourage everybody to take a look at this PDF, but I'm not sure where exactly they got these numbers from, but they do outline a bunch of different numbers, and it's pretty much how much time they suspect that developers are spending on tech debt every week. And so if you have, they said like the average developer spends about 41 hours a week total. And of that, 3.5 of those hours are spent on technical debt and 3.8 are spent on quote unquote, whatever they're calling bad code. So I think this is great, not just for developers. So we're aware, and I don't know, if anything for me, it made me feel like kind of I was justified in feeling bogged down in technical debt. Anyway, so I would encourage tons of people to read this and share it. If you have an open relationship with kind of the executives at your company at a higher level, I would encourage you to share it with them as well. Because sometimes if they're not touching code, it's hard for them to understand. Anyways, but on to my next pick, and I'll kind of expand on what I was saying earlier. So when I first started programming, this was like way before I ever went to a boot camp, somebody handed me a book on JavaScript. I didn't even know HTML or CSS yet, and I got pretty overwhelmed. But the next book I bought was Professional JavaScript for Web Developers, which is one of your books. And it literally is the book that made me realize that I could do programming. So I was feeling very overwhelmed, like I didn't know if this programming thing was for me. And potentially part of it is I'm one of those people who really likes to deep dive into things. And I think kind of understanding prototypes and how those worked in JavaScript was really tripping me up as a newbie. And your explanation of it in your book just really made things click for me and made me feel like I could keep going. So kind of, if you're not super comfortable with that in JavaScript, I love Kyle Simpson, but I also really, really, really love this book and would recommend people go out and buy it and check it out if you haven't already. And that is it for me.
Awesome.
Bye, guys. Sorry, I got to run.
Yeah, it's life.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye. See you guys later.
Chris, what are your picks?
I have 3 this week. The first is from my buddy Hayden Pickering. This site he put together, Inclusive Components. This really cool, it's kind of like this blog / design pattern thing, but it's basically a collection of common design patterns and components that you typically see on websites. And he deep dives into more robust and accessible ways to approach those things. So things like accordions, tab navigation, tooltips, a whole bunch of other stuff. He's also got a book based on the site that's going to get updated pretty regularly. But as someone who cares a lot about accessibility and things like that, but also sometimes struggles really bad with it, which is, I think, is the case for a lot of developers. It was just a really awesome resource. It's something that I pay a lot of attention to and still screw up all the time. And so there's just a lot of really great stuff on his site that everybody should dig into. The second one for me, as some of your listeners are probably already aware, there's at the time that this comes out, it'll probably have been about a month ago, but there was this big kerfuffle over a tweet from Max Stoiber around how well people knew CSS, and just a lot of confusion around things like the cascade and CSS classes and how different things inherit. So I just really, and a lot of folks arguing that it's the kind of thing that we don't need to worry about because we can just offload it to tooling. So I just really wanted to give a shout out to the CSS cascade today. I think it's something that a lot of JavaScript developers don't pay a lot of attention to or don't spend a lot of time thinking about or focusing on. And I've just found the more I've focused on learning CSS really well, the better my JavaScript has gotten as well. Because a lot of things that I would rely on JS for, I discover I can actually just handle with CSS in an easier or more performant way. So if you haven't taken time to look at all the cool stuff CSS can do these days, go take a look. And then finally, I just wanted to mention for folks, I write a whole bunch of guides, video courses, and other sorts of resources to help folks learn JavaScript, and in particular vanilla JavaScript better. If you listen to this podcast and you want to save money on any of that stuff, you can use the code JSJabber at checkout to get 30% off. So that's it for me this week.
Awesome. Cory, what are your picks?
So I have 3 picks as well. My first pick feels very relevant since we're talking about ESLint. One of my favorite ESLint rules is no restricted imports, which allows you to specify some libraries or any imports that people shouldn't import in. So if, for instance, you have some libraries that you have decided as a team shouldn't be pulled into your package or into your project. For instance, you've decided you shouldn't need jQuery since you're working in React, or you shouldn't need Lodash since you have Babel and modern JavaScript, so you should have most of the functionality that you need without that. This can be really useful for warning people about usage of tools that you've decided you shouldn't need. And you can even customize the messages there. I've also found it useful for deprecating internal components, for saying, all right, for a while we were using this component. Now we suggest using this instead. And I can put in the message, hey, this is deprecated. Go out here. Here's the new URL with more information. So really useful for deprecating tools as well. A book I just recently finished reading was Arnold Schwarzenegger's autobiography, which is called Total Recall. Fascinating book. It is unbelievable that one person could do so many different things, and both inspiring and also very cautionary. I mean, it's highly revealing all the costs, the trade-offs that come from the level of fame and success that he had there. So I like books that really delve into both sides of that issue. Finally, on the JS front, I don't know when this goes live, but stateofjs.com is the annual State of JavaScript survey. So I'd encourage anybody listening to go out to stateofjs.com and fill out the survey so we can find out what good stuff's going on in the JavaScript communities. That is it for me.
Awesome. Yeah, this episode goes out the end of October, so hopefully State of JS is still running. Yeah, and I think we usually wind up talking about it every year, so definitely go fill it in. It's always great just to see the direction that things are heading. Joe, do you have some picks for us?
Oh, sure. Speaking of the state of JS, can I pick thought bubbles?
Go ahead.
I'm going to pick, that's a joke. It was a joke. Thought bubbles. I was poking subtle fun at the state of JS survey.
Dang, Joe, right. That was too subtle. I've got to go.
It was a bit too subtle. Echo chambers? Picking up echo chambers. How about that?
There we go. Nice. Okay.
Picking echo chambers in relationship to the State of JS survey. Okay, I got 2 picks for you. The first one is a really interesting article that some guy named Jack Scott, who really hasn't blogged too much, put out on Hacker Noon. And it's raised he has 140 followers on Medium, and he's got 10,000 claps or something on this article. So it just went crazy. 3,000 claps at the time that I'm looking at it right now. Anyway, the article is called Goodbye Redux. And he lays out this very interesting and well thought out case for why there's another technology out that, and when he says Redux, really what he means is all Flux patterns, regardless of which framework you might be using. But he lays out this really interesting case why there's another technology that might reduce, if not eliminate, the need for Redux patterns in our front-end framework programming or front-end programming in general. Chris, you ever hear of anybody using Redux with vanilla JS?
I have not, actually.
That would be interesting. Or any Flux pattern, really. So I think it's a really great read. It's a short read, like 10 minutes long. I put a link to the show notes, but if you just Google Goodbye Redux, you will find it that way as well. So very interesting read and a lot of interesting comments on the article as well. And then my second pick is going to be a YouTube channel called Sideways. It's this crazy, awesome, but fantastically great channel focused on music it's got a bunch of really interesting videos. Like one is a deep dive into Rey's theme from Star Wars. And another one is on how movies use music to make us cry. And the answer of how they do that will surprise you. And so there's one is how to win an argument about pop music. And he lays out this really interesting history of pop music and culture and generation gaps and explains a lot of really interesting things. I found the channel fascinating and had to finally cut myself off to get some work done this morning after wanting to watch far too many of the videos. So if you have any interest at all in music and some of the behind the scenes stuff about music, which I assume is going to include a large percentage of people, you should definitely check out this channel, the Sideways channel. And again, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. And those are my picks.
Awesome. I've got a couple of picks I'm going to throw out there. The first one is, if you've been listening to My JavaScript Story, which is another show that I host and I interview people who, to get their story on how they got into JavaScript and what they're working on these days. I kind of started to feel like I wasn't getting the whole story because I want the My JavaScript Story podcast to represent people out there in the community. And so I opened it up. I sent an email out to my email list and I got a bunch of people who are listeners to the show, but have not been on the show to come on the show and talk, or on that show and talk about, themselves and their journey and things like that. And I'm really looking forward to those to start to come out. But if you are interested in being on My JavaScript Story, or if you do Angular and you want to be on My Angular Story, join the mailing list for one. I'll put a link in the show notes as to how you can get on, get on the calendar for that. But yeah, I've really just gotten a lot out of talking to people. One of the people I talked to was this Portuguese guy who's living in Sweden, and writing Vue.js. Talked to another developer who just graduated from Hack Reactor in New York. And so, I'm getting these variations on people's experience and hearing some things that are fairly typical, I guess, and some things that aren't. And so, anyway, I've really been enjoying having those conversations. So if you want to have that conversation, I will publish it. But I find that the more I can share people's experience, the better we can help the community and just get a real feel for where people are at and where they're coming from. So anyway, I guess I'm just going to pick that. And Nicholas, do you have some picks for us?
I do. I have three. The first is a book called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. And it's really fascinating. I don't know about you, but I was always taught growing up that you're born with a certain number of brain cells and you only ever lose them as you get older. And hence all of our parents telling us that, if we drink too much in our teenage years, we're just killing off brain cells that haven't even had a chance to do anything. But it turns out that that's not true. And the brain is constantly growing and changing. And as a result, it's capable of some pretty incredible recoveries. And so this book talks about brain neuroplasticity and goes through a bunch of medical cases, but also makes the case that to keep your brain functioning as well as it can, we really need a variety of experiences and in order to create the new neurons. And part of this has actually helped me regain some of the cognitive ability that I really had lost in the past couple of years. And it's very interesting. The second pick is also a book. It's called Ghost Boy, and it's by Martin Pistorius. And it's the story written by Martin himself of how he came out of locked-in syndrome. So he was unable to move, unable to communicate, and how he was able to recover. And not only that, the part that I really enjoyed about this book was how he focused on assistive technologies and how they really helped in his recovery and being able to let people know that he was actually in his body conscious, even though he was unable to move. It's just really moving, really inspiring, and really highlights for me just how important it is to make sure that we're all paying attention to making the technology we work on as accessible as possible. And the last pick is actually more of a tip, but for whatever reason, people seem to be having more trouble sleeping than usual. And I don't mean like in the past day, but I mean, our generation, a lot of people you talk to say they have trouble sleeping. And this tip is very simple. It's just turn off your Wi-Fi before you go to bed. And, you can turn it back on when you wake up in the morning, but there seems to be some research showing that the radio waves from Wi-Fi kind of keep your body in an alert state, and that can prevent you from sleeping as deeply and comfortably as you can. And I've tried this. I've noticed a difference. I've recommended it to some other people who've noticed a difference. If you're living in an apartment, it's probably not going to help that much because your neighbors all have Wi-Fi. But if you live in a house, definitely give it a try. Because sleep is super important. And if you can do any little thing to make it better, why not do it?
Sounds good. Well, thanks again for coming, Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great to catch up again.
All right, folks. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up, and we will be back next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.